So, welcome to lesson 4.4, which is about ideology and worldview. So, this is about the way that a civilization or a society has a certain set of values and beliefs that are shared by all or most of its members. And we're going to start with the idea of social cohesion. So, cohesion, sticking together, the way that the members of a society or civilization stick together, they're loyal to each other, and they cooperate with each other to make their society work and build their civilization. So let's start with the concept of cooperation. And we've seen in earlier lessons how cooperation arises when people have shared interests. So when interests are shared, it makes sense for everybody to work together to move towards that common interest. And we've also seen the work on the prisoner's dilemma, PD, how cooperation can emerge because people are better off through cooperating. Yes, you can get temporarily ahead by taking advantage of other people, but the only result is that everyone else will be trying to take advantage of you, so you'll all end up being worse off. So by cooperating, you do much better than by trying to take advantage of people. And while in the sort of basic prisoner's dilemma idea, it's a kind of one-on-one situation, you cooperate, the other person cooperates. In a society, it makes sense to cooperate so long as there's a kind of critical mass of other people cooperating. You need a critical mass. So if everybody is a litter lout, then there's no point in you picking up your litter because everybody else will just completely undo anything that you do. They'll just make the environment untidy. You won't be able to keep it tidy. So what's the point yourself picking up your litter? You need enough people who are prepared to pick up their litter to make it worthwhile for you to pick up your litter, and then together you'll be able to keep the environment tidy. So it's a kind of structure agency thing where you've got you, the individual, perform some action that will cooperate with other people. The individual, I decide to cooperate, and that will determine what happens. So I will cooperate by picking up my litter. That determines whether the environment's going to be tidy or not. And then if the environment is tidy because others are cooperating, so what others are doing, others cooperate, affects what it's worthwhile you doing. So it influences your behaviour. So your behaviour influences the environment for everybody else, which then influences their decisions about their own behaviour. And if you've got enough critical mass of people cooperating, then in this feedback loop, you'll see that everyone else is cooperating, so you'll be better off by cooperating as well, and so you cooperate. But then if the system starts to be invaded by people who are not cooperating, so people who don't share the values and beliefs of your civilization, who don't feel loyal to their fellow citizens, then that's going to reduce the number of people cooperating. And if it goes below a certain critical mass, then the cooperators aren't going to be able to create the nice environment that they want. And so they'll stop cooperating as well. So you can kind of go past a tipping point. This really implies the possibility of a tipping point where the number of cooperators in your civilization, the number of people who share its values, the number of people who feel loyal to the civilization goes below this critical mass, then your civilization or society could unravel very quickly. And the complexity scientist Stefan Thurner, Austrian Stephen Thurner, has done some work on the emergence of cooperation in an online game. And in this game, people could interact with other players or communicate with other players, message other players through Discord or through, a messaging system within the game. And what they found was, firstly, that communication was very important to the players. In fact, they kind of spent more time on talking with other players than on actually playing the game. That's supposed to say communication. And they also found that most people cooperate. So people who behaved in a negative way, trolls, people who are just unpleasant, they in the end they didn't get very much out of the game and they just drifted away. So yes, they might get some temporary pleasure by being a troll, but then people were just rude to them in return or just ignored them, so they drifted away. So you ended up with most people cooperated because as we learn from the prisoner's dilemma, you get more by cooperating. And then the next point, they found that people did exercise a tit-for-tat strategy. Again, that came out of the prisoner's dilemma, that by tit-for-tat, you punish bad behaviour and you reward good behaviour. So if other people cooperate, you cooperate with them, that's rewarding good behaviour. But if they're negative, if they defect, in the terminology of the prisoner's dilemma, then you defect as well, you punish their bad behaviour. And lastly, they found that there was persistence to behaviour. And again, the work on the prisoner's dilemma suggests this is important, being predictable. If you're operating the tit-for-tat strategy, you're very predictable. You will, if people take advantage of you, then you'll just take advantage back. But you keep exercising that strategy. If sometimes you are tit-for-tat-ish, but the other times you're rather weak and you let yourself be taken advantage of, then you're not being so persistent, you're not being so predictable in your behaviour, and that makes it harder for cooperation to arise. Well, that's what they found in the game, that in fact people are predictable. They tend to behave the same from time to time, from day to day. And in other words, this work shows that yes, indeed, the prisoner's dilemma kind of works in a real situation of real people interacting. So that if we're assuming that this is how cooperation emerges in societies and social cohesion, loyalty to others and sharing their modes of behaviour, then that is fair, because in the real world that is how it works. If you interact, you create a generally cooperative game where most other players are cooperative, and that causes most players then, seeing that other people are cooperative, to cooperate themselves. So that is how cooperation can emerge in societies, the basic principle behind it. Now, the emergence of cooperation is not just about being nice to other people, but it's about certain rules of behaviour or certain norms of behaviour. So in the online game, there may be beliefs or assumptions about this is how we do things in this game, and then everybody observes and cooperates with those norms of behaviour in the game, the rules of the behaviour in the game. And an example of that from real life is that many societies have traditions of hospitality to strangers. People who live in desert environments particularly have very strong traditions of helping strangers, so that if a stranger's wandering in the desert wanders into your camp, you give them food and drink and accommodation. and then they can go on their way. And that might seem to contradict the idea that how cooperation emerges in the prisoner's dilemma, because the point of the game theory work on that is it has to be iterated. It makes sense to cooperate so long as you keep meeting the same people over and over again. Then you get to trust them, and you get to be able to rely on the idea that they will cooperate, so it makes it worthwhile you cooperating. But if it's a one-off, then you'll always be better off by taking advantage or defecting, in the language of the game theory. And so this person who's wandered into your camp and then wanders off again, that's a kind of one-off encounter. And so it might seem, actually there is no advantage for you in cooperating with them. But this is an example of what social anthropologists call generalised reciprocity. So reciprocity means I do something for you, you do something for me. And specific reciprocity is where you're just interacting with a particular person. I do something for that person and that person does something for me. Generalized reciprocity is when I do something for another person, and then I can assume that a third person will do something for me. So it's not that person who returns the favour, but it's going to be someone else. And this is a norm. So the norm is we give hospitality to strangers. And if we can all observe that norm, then we can all rely on the fact that we're going to get hospitality in the situation where we're wandering in the desert and we need food and drink. So it is generalised. We give it to anyone, and then we can get it back from anyone. And the complexity scientist Simon DeDeo suggests that there are 3 stages in the evolution of such norms, which he calls transitions in political order. So the first transition for DeDeo is the recognition that group behaviour is the sum of individual behaviour. So this is recognising that the reason the environment is untidy is because people throw their litter on the floor. So it's recognising that what I do affects the environment for other people, and what other people do affects the environment for me. So this is something that would have emerged fairly early in hominid evolution. But it's a fundamental recognition for the development of norms, which is, for DeDeo, the next step. So the emergence of norms. So now behaviour is not just dependent on the particular situation. So it's not a case of just saying, oh, throw that piece of litter in the bin, but it's having a norm, a rule. We throw our litter in the bin. And now it becomes teachable. We can raise the young to observe this norm, or people coming into our society. We can say, hey, this is our norm. This is the way we do things around here. And it's also, it means that we can not just adjust our behaviour, but we can adjust the norms. So we're sort of operating at a higher level. So we can develop norms that work well. And then the next and third step, and final step for DeDeo, is the emergence of what he calls norm bundles. So this is not just ad hoc norms, but whole sets of norms that work well together and are consistent with each other, and that again, that we can raise the young to observe, and that govern the whole way to run a society. So they control all aspects of social life. And so with norm bundles, we can produce the kind of complex cultures and civilizations that we have today. Now, the sociobiologist Robert Ardrey developed a formula for the amount of cooperation in human groups. Now, Robert Ardrey was a playwright. He wasn't really a scientist, but he was struck by the idea that humans are animals and we can learn about human behaviour by studying animal behaviour. And he wrote various books on that topic. But he wouldn't really be taken seriously by professional sociobiologists or by anthropologists. But nevertheless, his formula is useful for our purposes. And what he said was that amity, as he called it, so that's the amount of cooperation between people, loyalty to others, getting on with other people, amity, friendliness, you could say, is equal to enmity plus hazards. So enmity is the enmity of other groups towards you, and hazards are just the general hazards of your environment, like, you know, thunderstorms, droughts, and animal predators. So his idea was that the amount of amity is equal to the amount of enmity from other groups plus the amount of hazards in the environment, or he wrote it in symbols, A equals E plus H. And these enmity and hazards are threats to your existence, either other people who may be attacking you or robbing you, your enemies, so they're a threat to your existence, and also hazards like, you know, as I said, thunderstorms and animal predators. They're also a threat to your existence. And so these present a common threat, and a large common threat creates a large amount of amity or cooperation between people because they've got a shared interest in resisting that threat. And as we said, cooperation arises when people have a shared interest. Now, hazards tend to be quite strong in places like the desert or in a cold environments, Arctic environments, Arctic wastelands, because in these places life is a struggle. So they present a hazard to your existence. And enmity is strong in places with dense populations because, you know, there's a lot of people around and a lot of strangers necessarily, and so you don't really know who they are, what their intentions are, so they present enmity towards you. And these tend to be places that are actually sort of quite easy places to live, because the very reason that they have dense populations is because they are benign environments without a lot of hazards. That's why many people go there, and so you get a lot of people and a dense population. And whereas in the desert and Arctic environments, their, you know, population is fairly sparse, again because, you know, in the desert it's difficult to live, so there aren't so many people around, so enmity is not so much of a problem. And these hazards affect everyone. You know, just by virtue of being a human, you're going to be subject to the same hazards in the desert, in the Arctic environment. So in these situations where hazards predominate, then you tend to get these norms of generalised reciprocity that we talked about. So hospitality to strangers. You know, everybody, just by being a human, is facing those same threats. So you're friendly to all humans, not just your narrow group. Whereas when hazards are few but enmity predominates, because you're in a dense population, then that's when people start to coalesce into these groups that have a lot of amity within them, resisting the enmity that surrounds them. So in this case, you get sort of close-knit groups, clans, that strongly cooperate with their own members, but have a lot of enmity towards other groups, the outsiders. And another angle on these things is Martin Sweatman, who's a kind of chemist physicist. He developed a model of how groups emerge, suggesting that there's a kind of attracting force and a repelling force, or there's a force, a social force if you like, which can go from attracting to repelling, and it's attracting close up and repelling further away. So the force between people, if this is distance, when people are close, there's an attracting force between them. When they're further away, there's a repelling force. So, if we've got some people here, there's a person, there's another person nearby, and there's some more people here. So here, this person is close. So they're going to experience an attracting force towards them. But here, they're far away. So the force is repelling. So it's pushing them away from those people, whereas they're attracted towards this one who's close by, because close means an attracting force. So you can see how this is going to lead to groups or clustering. And in fact, this is how Sweatman developed this model to explain clustering of particles in chemical solutions. And he suggested that the same kind of model can explain the emergence of groups within society. There's a repelling force, an attracting force for those who are close to you, and a repelling force for those who are further away. Also, you like the people who are nearby, and you dislike the people who are further away. And that will create these social clusters. Okay, we're now going to talk about something called multi-level selection. So we know how basic natural selection works, or we ought to, that here's an individual and they have some individual fitness, and they're exposed to some environment, and their fitness to that environment determines their survival. But with multi-level selection, we consider people to be parts of groups. So here's a group of individuals. So they have a group fitness, and that group is exposed to some environment, and the fitness of the group to the environment affects the survival of the whole group. So it's a bit like if you're running in the individual 100 meters, whether you get through to the finals, whether you win, depends upon your individual fitness, how fast you personally can run. That's the only thing that's going to affect whether you win the competition at the end of the day. But if you're in a team event like the relay race, then it doesn't just depend on how fast you are, but also how fast your team is. So it's the overall fitness of your team, the overall speed of your team. So you could be a very good runner, but if you've got a really slow runner in your group, then you won't get through the heats into the final. So whether you survive depends on the overall properties of the group, not just on you. But it doesn't only depend on the group, it also depends on your individual capabilities as well, because if you are a slow runner, then it's no use being in a team with other fast runners, because you'll just bring down the whole team. So your individual fitness is important to the fitness of the group, but it's not the only thing that matters. You also depend on what other people in your group are capable of as well. So it both are important, your individual fitness and the fitness of your overall group. So that's why this is multi-level selection. It's selecting the fastest runners and the fastest groups, whereas here it's just selecting the fastest runners. So this is, you know, we could say basic natural selection. And we're going to be interested in multi-level selection. We're going to derive an equation that describes how it works, known as the price equation. So with the multi-level case, we can say that survival is made up of two things. It's group survival plus individual survival. And because it's survival, or the survival of the fittest, that drives evolution, so the fittest survive and pass on their genes to the next generation, so the population changes towards those genes that are the fittest. We can say that then evolution is also made up of these two things. It's group selection, selecting the best group, plus individual selection. And what we're going to do is derive an equation that expresses that qualitative formula there. And the derivation I'm going to give is a simplified one. It's not completely rigorous, but it will show you where the equation comes from. And it's known as the price equation, after the person who first developed it. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so let's think about individual selection at first. So we've got a population of individuals, and they have a probability of exhibiting a particular trait, we'll say. So a trait like running fast to get away from tigers. And each person, depending on their genes, has a different probability of showing that trait. So the probabilities for each individual are P1, P2, P3, etc. So this is person 1, person 2, person 3. So we can say that the individual probability is PI, where the I stands not for individual but for 1, 2, 3. It's the count of the person. So that's the ith person that's the individual probability of showing the trait, such as running fast. And then the overall probability in the population is just going to be the average of the individual probabilities. So each person has a particular individual probability of being able to run fast, and for the average, some will be faster, some will be slower. It will average out. So the overall probability in this population of being able to run fast, P, is just the average of all the individual probabilities. And then evolution is about a change in the overall probability. So that's evolution. So if running fast is something good to have, then we would expect the probability of running fast to increase. There would be a delta P, a change in the probability. And so that change is evolution happening in the population. In the next generation, the average probability has increased. And this change in probability is going to depend upon the variability in the population. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's consider two populations of different variability. Okay, so here are two populations, population 1, population 2. This one I've said has high variability, so how much it's coloured in shows how strongly they have that particular trait, or the probability of showing that particular trait. So here, this person has a very high probability, it's very densely coloured in. This person somewhere in the middle, and this person has a very low probability, it's blank. Whereas in this population there's low variability between the people. This person has a slightly higher probability than that, which is a slightly higher probability than that. So this one is a bit below, this is a bit above, but there's not so much variation between them. Well, evolution is going to work much better on this population because it can distinguish between them. The fastest runner is definitely going to win out here, whereas here, well, their speeds are pretty close, so just by pure chance this guy might just succeed, but here he's definitely not going to, because he's really very far behind this one. So evolution will select out the best here much more easily than trying to select out the best from these who are all much of a muchness. So the higher the variability, the greater the change we would expect to see in the next generation, the greater the amount of separating the wheat from the chaff, from sifting out those who've got the trait from those who haven't. So that's why we said here that the change in P, change in the probability, is going to be proportional to the variability of the population, which we can write then as the variance, using the statistical variance of the different probabilities. How much do they vary around the mean? The variance of the probabilities for all the different people, referring back to the statistics lesson that we did in the mathematics module. And then we can change this proportional sign to an equal sign by writing a constant of proportionality, beta. So beta we can think of as the selection pressure. So if there isn't much selection pressure, if it doesn't really matter, there aren't any predators, so how fast you can run doesn't really make much difference to your survival, then beta is low. There's very little selection pressure, and so there won't be much change in the probability of being able to run fast in the next generation. Whatever you run, whether it's fast or slow, you're probably just as much likely to survive. So there's low selection pressure. But if selection pressure is high, so that running fast is really important because there's lots of tigers around, then beta will have a large value, and so the change in the probability of being able to run fast in the next generation will be large, because beta is large, but it also depends, as we've also said, on the variability. So this equation describes the evolution, as we can think of it, the change in the probability of showing a trait as a function of the variability in the population. And we're now going, we've just been looking here at individual selection, but we're now going to move on to talk about multi-level selection, which is our goal. Okay, so we've now got the situation where there are several groups, and within each group there are various individuals. And so now we talk about the probability of showing the trait by the ith person in the jth group. So that's Pij. So these are groups 1, 2, 3. So this is the jth group number j. And then within each group there's people 1, 2, 3. And so that's the ith person in the jth group, Pij. And then for the group as a whole, it will have an overall Pj, the probability of showing the trait, the average in that group. So just as we did in the individual case, the probability for the group as a whole is just the average of the individual probabilities within the group. So Pj is equal to Pij bar. And then there is an overall P, the probability of showing that trait for this population as a whole, all the individuals in all the groups. And the probability for the population as a whole is going to be the average of the probabilities for each group. So P equals Pj bar. And then what we're interested in is the change in this P. Well, first of all, we can say that for the PJs, there's going to be a change in those, just as we had here. It's going to be, the change is going to depend upon a selection pressure, beta, and also the variability within the group. So it will depend on the variance of the PIJs within that group. So some of these individuals within the group will survive better than others, and that will tend to change the average for the group as a whole. And just as with that formula there, we've just written it down again. It's going to depend on selection pressure times variation variance. And then, as I said, we're really interested in the change for the population as a whole. Well, the change for the population as a whole is just going to be the average of the changes for all the groups. Some will increase, some decrease, they may cancel out, and there'll be some overall average change. So it will be, delta Pj, average of delta Pj. That will be the average change for the population. And since we've got for the delta Pj's here, this will be the average of, well, beta is just a constant, and so it will just be the average of these variances, Pij, averaged. But now we're at the moment just considering the change in P, the overall probability of the trait, from individual selection within each group. And it was the average of the individual selections within all the groups. So we can call this the change in P due to individual selection within the groups. We can write that beta as beta I, the beta for individual selection. But we're also interested in group selection. So some of these groups will survive better than others just because they have a higher probability of showing the trait. And the groups are in competition with each other. Like I said, you know, if it's a relay race, the relay teams are in competition with each other. So some relay teams will get through the heats and others won't. So we're interested in the increase in probability due to the fact that some of these groups survive better than the others. And for that, we can just use this formula again. It's going to be delta P is going to be equal to beta times the variability, the variance rather, in now the groups. So this was for individuals, but now we're treating the groups as the individuals, and we're thinking about, you know, which groups survive best. Well, natural selection would be more effective on these groups if there's more variation in the groups. If some are really good and some are really poor, then natural selection will find it easier to sift them one from the other. And it will also depend on a selection pressure beta again. So we can say then this is the change in P due to the group selection, and we can write this constant beta as beta G for group selection. So the total change in probability is just the sum of these two, delta P G plus delta P I. So we can write delta P equals delta PG from there, and delta pi from there. And this is the price equation. So what it's saying is that the overall change of a trait in the population depends on the group selection plus the individual selection. And what is particularly of interest is that we said this beta is a selection pressure, and the larger beta, the stronger the selection pressure. But beta could also be negative, which would mean that the trait is detrimental. So, you know, tasting good or something, that for tigers. If it's detrimental, then you would expect that trait to disappear. Why this is of interest is because one of these may be negative and the other positive. So group selection and individual selection can be pulling in different directions. So for example, it might be a trait of aggressiveness. Now for individuals, aggression might be good. You might help you survive if you're aggressive. But if you think about group selection, a group full of aggressive people, they won't necessarily get on very well, and so the group won't function so well, and so the group might do less well. Aggression is good for the individual but not for the group. And then the interesting question is then, how does that balance work? Or particularly, and this is what we're going to study now, the interest is that it's kind of vice versa, that when we cooperate with others, it can reduce our own fitness because we're doing things for other people instead of for ourselves. We're spending energy helping out others instead of just looking after number one. Of a particular behaviour, helping others, the selection pressure may be negative. It's actually harming us, but it's helping the group of which we're a part. And so because it helps the group, that can counterbalance the negative effect on the individual. And so you know, we're interested then in how does that work and can that work? So let's have a look at that. Okay, so we're now going to discuss the idea of altruism. And I've written up here again the price equation. So the increase in the probability of a trait depends upon the group selection plus the individual selection. Now, altruism means what we do for others. So it's the opposite of egoism. Egoism is what I do for myself, helping myself. Altruism is what I do for others, helping others. And it comes from the Latin words ego or ego is I, and alter is other, others. And in terms of the price equation, we can say this is about the ego. This is individual selection. This is what I do to help myself. And this is about alter. It's what I do to help others, to help group survival. Behaviours that help the survival of the group. And these are behaviours that help the survival of the individual, i.e. me. And one way of thinking about this is, let's suppose we've got a group with a population equal to n, that there's some behaviour that brings a benefit to each person of b, but it costs the person c, and the fraction performing this behaviour is r. So out of the total population of n, a fraction r are providing this behaviour, this altruistic behaviour to others. Well, for a particular person, the benefit is going to be n, the number, times r, the fraction providing the behaviour, performing the behaviour, times the benefit that the behaviour brings me. So that's a number performing it, n times r, and that's the benefit I get from each person performing that behaviour. But so yeah, that's the total benefit, net benefit, let's say. And the cost to me is, because I'm providing this behaviour to a population n, is going to be c times n. So that's the net cost to me. And what we require is for this behaviour to be worthwhile, and therefore to be selected by natural selection and to persist, the benefit has got to exceed the cost. Otherwise I wouldn't do it. So we can cancel the n's from both sides, and so we just get RB has got to be greater than C. So if the cost increases of this behaviour, or the benefit decreases, or the fraction of people performing it decrease, any of those things will make this become less likely to be RB greater than C. And if that increases too much, or either these declines too much, then this will actually no longer be greater than C, and the behaviour will disappear. So this takes us back to what I said at the beginning about a critical mass. There must be a certain number R, and that if you go below that critical mass, you can get, it's a tipping point where suddenly the behaviour of the whole group will change. It will good cooperative behaviour will suddenly disappear because it now costs too much and the benefits aren't worthwhile, or there aren't enough people doing it. So, we can pay taxes because we get roads and we get hospitals, say. But if the taxes go up, but the roads aren't being repaired, the hospitals aren't being built, or there are too many freeloaders, then this equation will change, and suddenly people will, no longer be prepared to pay taxes, and you'll run into serious problems of managing your society. Now, the anthropologist Samuel Bowles took this price equation and he thought about the evolution of cooperative behaviour in human groups from prehistoric times using it. So he suggested that it is a competition between groups that creates this selection pressure, which we've represented here by beta G. So the more competition between groups, then the more likely it is that some groups will survive better than others. And particularly it is violence between groups. So intergroup violence, he suggested, in prehistoric societies is what created this pressure towards a group selection. So made people behave altruistically towards other members of their group because they faced these violent threats from other groups, so they were much more prepared to cooperate with their own group to resist that threat. And he said that in fact if you look at the world prehistorically, the evidence is very much for a lot of violence. Skeletons from the Stone Age often have signs of violence, and indeed in primitive societies today, intergroup violence tends to be very high. So he said this intergroup violence certainly existed, and it would have created this selection pressure. So he uses that to explain why altruism arose, principles of altruism arose in human groups. But what he found, though, if you put in reasonable assumptions about the amount of conflict and the benefits of cooperating with others, the effect was quite marginal. Because by cooperating with others, you reduce your own individual fitness, but you increased it increase that of your group. But although it was enough to make altruism arise, it was still quite a weak effect. And so, because of that, it means that altruism in humans is very local. It doesn't extend very far. We're altruistic with small groups around us, but not with very large ones, and not with humanity as a whole, because this the group effect is only slightly greater than the individual effect, or at least only slightly compensates for the detriment to the individual. And we can see as well that this is also coming back to Ardrey's A equals E plus H. I mean, Ardrey's A equals E plus H captures these ideas that it's this enmity, this is the intergroup violence that Bowles is talking about. And it's this that is the selection pressure from this intergroup violence, enmity, is what creates amity or cooperation or altruism, as we're now calling it. So yes, E is this conflict, intergroup violence that Bowles is talking about. And we can see that altruism is costly to the individual, because it's again implied in this equation that if enmity decreases, so if intergroup violence decreases, then amity will decrease. And amity decreases because it is costly to be altruistic. So you know, if you don't have to, then you won't be altruistic. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about in this topic of social cohesion is asabiyyah. This is an Arabic word from Ibn Khaldun, and it means social cohesion. So it means, well, let's write that, cohesion. Cohesion, of course, means sticking together. It means loyalty, cooperation, altruism, what it's called fellow feeling. All those kinds of things are summed up in the word asabiyyah. And as I say, this is key part of Ibn Khaldun's theory, which we will come on to in a later lesson when we look at social cycles. We'll see his theory. But in a nutshell, his idea is that the founders of a dynasty have strong asabiyyah, just abbreviate that to asab, and then the successors have weak asabiyyah. So asabiyyah declines in a society over time, and when it's declined enough, then new founders come in and found a new dynasty, again with strong asabiyyah. That's his Ibn Khaldun's theory. And weak asabiyyah, this means then things like disloyalty. It's what we would consider defection in the prisoner's dilemma, non-cooperation. So it means selfishness, exploitation, corruption, part of selfishness, you know, not considering the wider society, just what suits you, and crime, not caring about your fellow members of society, but just seeing them as people to prey upon. and mistrust of others is another part of it. So all the opposites of what we would consider cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma. In the prisoner's dilemma, you trust people, you don't exploit them. So with weak asabiyyah, it's all the opposite of that. And when we were talking about multi-level selection just now, we considered the idea that an individual is part of a group, and that we can focus either on the selections of pressures on the individual or on the selection pressures on the group. Well, a society in a similar way is kind of multi-level, because it's a society that typically contains subgroups within it, local groups like towns or classes or different religions and so on. So there is the global level of the society, and then there is the local level of these different subgroups. And asabiyyah can be different in the local groups versus the global society as a whole. And there are sort of two extreme cases that we consider. One is where I'll put the asabiyyah of the local groups is strong, but the asabiyyah of the society as a whole, the global asabiyyah, is weak, versus strong global or national asabiyyah and weak asabiyyah at the local level. And these two are necessarily opposite, because if your loyalties are to your local group, then they're not to the wider society. If your loyalties are to the wider society, then they're not to your local group. So, but you have to choose. So, for example, if your friend has committed a crime, you can either be loyal to your friend and keep it quiet, cover up for him, or you can be loyal to the wider society and say, oh no, turn him in because he's committed crime, he's committed something against the wider society. So your loyalty is either going to be to your friend or to the wider society, but it can't be both. So you're going to be either one or the other of these. And Western societies tend to be more like this these days. They're monocultural, so they're based on shared values that really pervade the whole society, a single culture, at least they were until recently, as I'm just about to say. And this has been hard won to get to this kind of global asabiyyah, because it's come about through many struggles. It's also come about through technological changes, transport and communications changes that have allowed much greater mixing of the populations. Well, let's write those two things up, hard ones. So that's from struggles and mixing. And another factor that's been pointed out is, in fact, this comes from Ibn Khaldun himself, is government welfare programs. Ibn Khaldun says that when the government takes more responsibility for welfare, then people rely less on their local group. And of course, if the nation is raising taxes to provide welfare, then people have less money left over for charity to their local friends and family, their local groups. And the government being identified with the whole society, if it's a dispenser of largesse through the welfare programs, then people's loyalties shift towards the wider society that seems to be the source of their welfare. But many non-Western societies are more like this. They are more tribal, divided into groups where there's very little welfare at the national level. People do rely much more on their friends and neighbours to provide charity and to help them out. And so they are often multicultural societies. And clearly the West, under the pressures of immigration, is moving back towards a more multicultural situation. Groups of different cultures within a weaker overall national state at the global level. So asabiyyah is tending to become more localized and less concentrated at the commitment, loyalty, all these things to the society as a whole. Now, countries with this kind of arrangement associated with the lower frequency of clubs and societies, civic organisations, so things like Sunday sports leagues, Rotary clubs, environmental societies like the National Trust in the UK or the Sierra Club in the US. So fewer civic organisations. And this is because people are really not focused on those concerns of wider interest. They're only focused on their local concerns, so they don't join things. And these societies also tend to be characterized by higher levels of corruption, but it's only a tendency. It has been argued that actually corruption isn't so necessarily as much higher in these kinds of societies than this one, but there is some general tendency for corruption to be higher, which again makes sense because people are really only concerned for their local group. They see the rest of the society as something to be taken advantage of, exploited. There's little cooperation with other groups, whereas here there's cooperation across the whole society. Here it's very localized cooperation and not between these groups. So people don't have the same compunction about behaving corruptly, taking advantage. And they're also associated with weak democratic institutions. Democracy is weak. And again, this is because people tend to vote along ethnic or local lines. So they're only interested in terms of democracy, they're only interested in getting power for the benefit of their own tribe. So they try to capture the government. So the most powerful clans will, once they get into the top positions of government, then they'll give all the positions to people from their own clan, and then they've captured the government, and then they run the country for the benefit of their own particular subgroup, clan, tribe, whatever, religion, etc. So democracy tends to be weaker in these kinds of societies towards which the West is now moving. And one thing that tends to make societies be more like this, with local loyalties, is cousin marriage. People marrying their cousins. So that means that they marry within their group, within their extended kin network. So that all the marriage ties stay within the local clan or tribe, and people don't become connected to others across the society. So that tends to keep these loyalties local. And so people have argued that the prevalence of cousin marriage in a society, which you can measure, is kind of a measure of the extent to which it is structured like this, and also claim correlations between the incidence of cousin marriage and, say, weak democratic institutions. And lastly, I'll just mention about the EU. Is starts from this kind of position. These would be, in the case of the EU, these would be the different countries of the EU, and that's the EU as a whole. People within the EU still have a large amount of loyalty to their own country rather than feeling it's owed to the European Union. the EU wants to move in this direction towards this configuration where people feel, hey, we're Europeans. French, German, means nothing. We're just Europeans. So that's what the EU is trying to promote, and so it has various strategies for doing that. What it calls the communitaire attitudes or feelings. It wants to promote that in Europe's populations, to feel communitaire. We're members of the European Union. We're not, divided into different nationalities. And the sorts of strategies it uses are, first, it has an identity with a flag, an anthem, to get people to unite behind. It has promoted books and research programs that emphasize European unity. So, for example, it sponsored a book that talked about the history of Europe as a whole and tried to emphasize the connections across Europe and how Europe moved forward on a common front. And it's promoted research programs bringing together the scientists or the historians of the European Union, again trying to solve scientific or historical problems, questions at a European level. It has when it pays for roads and things, it gives grants towards roads, dams, other projects around the European Union. It has billboards that say this project was funded by the European Union, and that it comes back to this thing about government welfare. When your money is coming from the European Union, so the billboards tell you, of course it's your own money that you've given to the European Union and comes back to you, but when the billboards tell you it's coming from the European Union, then the idea is you'll feel more, the European Union is something we've got to get behind, so your loyalties go to the hand that is feeding you, the European Union. And it has as well something called the European Cultural Foundation, whose whole mission is to create this communitaire feeling or European sentiment. So it seeks ways to do that. So the EU is self-consciously trying to go from there to there. Many Western societies at the moment are going from there to there. Well, the European Union may see that as beneficial to it, because if a Western society, if that's a Western society, and this is the European Union, the Western society looks like this, strong at the global level of that society and weak at the local level. Well, if you're transforming that now, that European society into something more like this, it's weakening, Frenchness or Germanness, and maybe there's more sort of little cultures appearing within it. But from the EU's perspective, it's good. You're moving, the more that decreases, the hope would be that the more the communitaire feelings would increase. So the EU is seeing that as individual societies are moving in that direction, the EU as a whole is moving in that direction, which is where it wants to get to. Or at least some cynics and conspiracy theorists might suggest that, the EU is deliberately encouraging certain social trends within European societies because of this effect.